Hi, and welcome back to Map the Maze. So today I wanted to discuss a question that a lot of people ask in different ways. And the question is, do people change through mediation? Short answer, long answer? Short answer, no. Can people change behavior through mediation? Maybe. The way that people raise this question is that people often come in when I meet them in the intake and they say to me, the other person is impossible to deal with, particularly if there are children. I can't co-parent with them, that I can't even imagine being able to go through the mediation process together because there is no ability to communicate, to problem solve, and that I want them to either go back to the way they were before whatever the event was that ruptured the relationship, or I want them to change in a way that I think is reasonable. One thing I would say is no mediator in the world has a magic wand, and that none of us have the ability to change people. The mediation process doesn't change who people fundamentally are, that if people have certain values around finances or children, then they will have those values at the beginning of the mediation, during it, and at the end of it. And if people have beliefs about things like divorce and separation and marriage and co-parenting, then the chances are they will have those same beliefs at the beginning, in the middle, and at the end. And what I sometimes get asked is, so can you make the other person be reasonable? And as you can probably imagine, when people are asking that question, what they're really saying is, can you make them agree with what I would like to do, with the proposals I have made for the arrangements going forward? That it's very rarely about achieving an objective standard of reasonableness, which in itself is hard enough to do. I cannot think of the number of lectures I went to as a law student when we had to talk about the reasonable man on the Clapham omnibus, which, for those of you who don't know what an omnibus is, it was just a bus. If we can't make people reasonable through mediation, and you can't fundamentally change who people are or what they believe, why do people come to mediation? One reason is obviously to get arrangements in place. But what I would say, and this is something that you will hear if you speak to your lawyer about what courts will do, particularly for co-parenting going forward, is that courts do not have the luxury of time, attention to detail that you can achieve in mediation. And so one of the challenges is that courts use what lawyers call a broad brush approach. So they can set up things like, how will big decisions be made for the children? Typically, where will the children live? How will they spend time with each of the parents? What do you do around holidays? But actually living those arrangements, how will you actually communicate to make those joint decisions? What happens if there needs to be a change to the arrangements that you have in place because maybe one of you is really sick, or now one of you has an emergency trip that you need to make out of the jurisdiction? What do you do? How do you communicate with the other parent? What are some of the fallbacks, the contingencies that might be helpful so that you don't have to renegotiate or reinvent the wheel every time something happens? All of those things you can do in mediation. That the level of focus on children and the way that life has been lived is much higher in mediation because we have time. We have time for people to speak about what's important to them, what their hopes, their fears are for their children in a way that you do not have when you're in court. And so one thing that I have seen is that even though people's beliefs and who they are doesn't fundamentally change, that people can agree to different behaviours going forward. Not in the past, because you can't go back, but going forward to find a way that you can function together. Because one of the things that's really clear about the mediation process is we are not trying to recreate adult relationships. This isn't counselling. We're not trying to heal those breaches. What mediators are trying to do in family mediation, where there are children, is help parents find a pathway forward. And that pathway will have things like communication, boundaries, behaviour, how do you deal with new partners, which, as you can imagine, is really controversial and can be really difficult for people to speak about. Because it's normalized, we always talk about it in family mediation. It's perfectly normal. I think it really helps to take some of the heat out of those conversations, to make them acceptable so that everybody in the room can engage in that conversation. And what I have seen is that people can change their behavior, not who they are, but how they behave. And at the end of the day, we never really know what is going on in somebody else's brain or in their heart. All we can look at is their behavior. I worked with a couple several years ago, and they were able to come to arrangements for their children and their finances. It was very contentious, though. It was very conflictual. One of the parties was very angry about how the relationship, the adult relationship, had broken down. But they were both very child-focused, despite the fact that he was incredibly angry with his former partner. They were able to put arrangements in place. One of those arrangements was co-parenting guidelines. How would they communicate going forward? And one of the things that we try as family mediators to work with people on, if they're willing to do that, is the communication needs to actually be bilateral. It needs to be based on discussion, consensus building. It can't be demands. It can't be telling the other parent. It can't be threatening and intimidating the other parent. And for this couple, a lot of those communication strategies were new. So they went away, and then a couple of years later, one of the parents decided that they wanted to relocate. So they came back to mediation, and I met with them before we had the joint session, and it was really interesting to me. He was still very angry. The level of anger hadn't really diminished, and I thought, this is going to be a long session. Talking about relocation is probably the most difficult thing that you do with parents. And then again, the level of anger hadn't subsided. We get to the mediation session, and the wife explains why she wants to relocate, what her thinking is around that. And the husband, former husband, was still angry. The tone was still angry. But what he managed to do, which I thought was so incredible, was that he had taken on board the communication strategies and the way that you discuss things. He acknowledged the things that she had said. He clarified the information that he needed to clarify, that he hadn't been clear about in her proposal. And he then suggested options himself. He came up with proposals, and he invited her to ask him questions to clarify, and then he invited her to ask him questions about those proposals, so that they could try and come up with a counter-proposal that would work for both of them. I was astounded, because even though I don't know how many co-parental guidelines I've drafted now and how many communication strategies I've drafted, you don't really know if they're being used, and you don't know if they are helpful to people until you see it with your own eyes and hear it with your own ears. And I was so impressed by his ability to, despite the fact that he definitely didn't want to be back at mediation and he didn't want to talk about relocation, that he was able to alter the way he communicated with his ex-wife to enable them to have the best conversation they could. It was so reassuring for me, because often when I'm working with people and they come to a resolution and the agreements are signed and they go off and they get their court orders, you always wonder, how will they live this court order? How will their children benefit or not benefit from the way in which their parents can navigate the co-parenting roadmap after separation? And I was really pleased that for these parents who were child-focused, that they were able to find a way to communicate, which meant it still wasn't easy to communicate, and maybe it will never be easy for them, but that they were able to hear each other, that they were able to engage with each other in a way that was constructive, in a way that was respectful, and in a way which enabled each parent to actually share their views. So I would guess one thing I would say is mediation doesn't change who anybody is, and it certainly, in my experience, has never made anybody reasonable, whatever that means, but it can change behaviours going forward. And at the end of the day, that is all we can see. You really never know what is in somebody else's heart. But you can understand how you're being spoken to and how communication goes. So I guess I would say, long story short, no, mediation doesn't change who people are, but it can change what they do. For some parents, for some families, for some children, that will be enough. That is actually a big win. So if you're thinking about mediation and you're hoping that this is a way to change the other parent, that is not going to happen. But can it change their behavior? Can it change and adjust your behavior? Yeah, definitely. That I have seen. Thank you for joining, and I will see you next week.